Hello and welcome to, I think this is now the 10th Royal Economic Society webinar series on economic and policy issues relating to the COVID-19 crisis. So far, these webinars have largely focused on the macroeconomy or on particular sectors, all of which is clearly incredibly important. But today we are going to bring it back to the micro. We have four very impressive speakers. I think that reflects the pulling power of the Royal Economic Society and also the importance of COVID-19. So I'll just say who they are in order, because when we get onto the session, they're just going to go smoothly from speaker to speaker. So first we will have Massimo Motta. His day job is professor at the Barcelona Graduate School of Economics. He also served as chief economist at DG Competition. And as many of you will know, he pretty much wrote the Bible for the economics of competition policy for students in that area. John Vickers is actually a former Royal Economic Society president. He's also a former head of the Office of Fair Trading, and his day job now is Warden of All Souls at University of Oxford. Fiona Morton, her day job is professor at Yale, but she has also served as chief economist at the Department of Justice Antitrust Division, and also led on a very influential major US report on digital competition last year. And Jacques Cremer, he is professor at Toulouse School of Economics, and he recently acted as a special advisor to Margrethe Vestager, the competition commissioner in Brussels, and in that role also authored or co-authored an important report on digital competition. The discussion today will focus around the implications of COVID-19 crisis and its aftermath for competition policy, particular focus on state aid, mergers and excessive pricing. Each panelist, the way we've set it up, is each panelist is going to speak for about 8 to 10 minutes. There won't be any slides. And we will then have 15 to 20 minutes at the end for a panel discussion and for Q&A. Please do send through questions. I think that something's just come up on the chat function telling you how to send your questions in. Please do that during the session, because actually there's a time delay between you sending the questions and then us being able to look at them. So please send as many as you can during the session, and at the end I will endeavour to curate them and ask them to our panellists. We then have an absolutely hard stop at 2 p.m. So hopefully I'll have a chance to say thank you to our panellists before then. And with that, I will hand hopefully smoothly over to Massimo.
Thanks, Amelia. Thank you very much for inviting me. I will argue that since the crisis has affected different sectors in different ways, the policy responses should also be contingent on the type of sectors that we are talking about. And so I will broadly divide the economy in 3 different sectors. The first are the sectors in which the crisis has had no negative impact. In those sectors, clearly, there is no reason to resort to state aid, in my opinion, or to relax competition rule. If anything, in this category, there are also some products and services for which one might think of particular competition interventions. For instance, if you are thinking of essential products which have experienced exceptional price hikes because of excess demand, then excessive price actions, which are rarely used in antitrust, might actually be considered. Of course, these are a last resort tool, but for jurisdictions where anti-price gouging laws or consumer protection provisions were not available, one might want to consider these interventions, which are rare indeed in competition law. Another comment that I would like to do in the same vein is the fact that among the very few winners of the COVID crisis, there are certainly the very big digital platforms. And these, with the crisis, they have probably increased and cemented even further their dominant positions. So in my opinion, there is the need for more interventions on those platforms, whether it is from the point of view of competition policy or light regulation. But I think the need is even more pressing nowadays after the crisis. Then there are sectors in which the crisis has had likely temporary negative effects. So, and in those sectors, I believe that well-designed state aid should be welcome, because state aid would actually prevent the exit of firms which are otherwise efficient. So there are many firms which are efficient, which are in principle solvent, but because of the liquidity problems created by the crisis, by the lockdowns, etc., might otherwise be obliged to shut down. So I think that it would be very important there, and indeed we have seen that in many countries, the state aids have been introduced almost immediately, and I think it was a good idea. So I think that their state aid is very important. One thing which I think it's very important to realize is that otherwise, without the state aids, these companies would have to dissolve crucial employer-employee relationships and accumulated firm-specific human capital. They would have to delay investments which would be very important for the long-run prospects of the firms. Plus, you might also have an important contagion effects, like for instance, if you have a supplier which, because of liquidity problem, is obliged to shut down, this might actually have impact along all of the supply chain. One thing also which I think it's very important to underline is that in this particular crisis, what has happened is completely exogenous to the firm. So we are in a completely different environment than the one of the banking crisis after 2008. So here there are no moral hazard issues. Also, I believe it's important to underline that we cannot believe that the market forces, let alone, might necessarily select the most efficient firms. In fact, there is some empirical evidence which is mounting and which started with works by Caballero and co-authors on the Japanese depression, but then it has been confirmed also on works such as, for instance, by Schivardi, Tabellini, and Sette on the more recent financial crisis. There is empirical evidence, I was saying, that if anything, is actually the less efficient firms which are more likely to receive additional credit or loan extensions from banks. And this is because in periods of crisis, banks might have the wrong incentives and might prefer to continue to extend credit to firms which are in crisis just in order to avoid writing off capital. This is the so-called zombie lending phenomenon. So for all these reasons, I believe that the state aid is important. Of course, it should be well designed. It's important that it should be the least distortionary possible, that it should be effective, and that it should be incentivizing and not wasting public money. Now, in this particular category of sectors where the problem is likely just temporary, I believe the answer is certainly not relaxing merger control. I think relaxing merger control here would be counterproductive, because here you have a temporary problem, and merger would be irreversible and would lead to a permanent loss of competition. So I believe that mergers are certainly not the answer here. more generally, when talking about whether we should think of strict enforcement of competition rules, one possible relaxation of competition enforcement might take place as far as agreements between competitors is concerned. So, for instance, in the UK, the CMA has taken swift action to reassure companies that they could actually temporarily coordinate their action so as to better guarantee supply of important essential goods. So provided that these agreements are temporary, they are necessary, and they are proportional to their objectives, I think it makes a lot of sense that in this particular area, competition rules are relaxed. Finally, there is a third category of sectors, which are those in which the crisis might actually have a negative, permanent, long-run impact, and in which, therefore, one might expect that there is going to be some consolidation which is needed in the long run. For these sectors, I see much less of a role for state aid, as I believe that state aid here might lead to inefficient outcomes and misallocation of resources. There's still some scope for public policies in general as accompanying measures, and I'm thinking of employment support, the requalification of human capital, investment in infrastructure, all measures which can actually smooth adjustment. Now, here in these sectors, relaxation of merger control might actually lead to a faster consolidation. However, even here, I believe that relaxation of merger control would actually come at a very significant cost, among other things, because it would actually prevent the restructuring of some firms, which after restructuring and downsizing, they might become efficient again. And also because there is no guarantee that those mergers would actually select the most efficient firms. I believe here that what would happen is that the mergers would be driven by profitability reasons, and the most profitable mergers are not necessarily the ones which are socially the most desirable ones. Finally, I think that what is going to happen here is that probably there will be many mergers in which the firms will claim the so-called Fein firm defense arguments. So saying basically this firm will go out of the market anyway. So in order to keep the assets in the sector, let the merger happen. Historically, competition authorities have enforced the Fein firm defense very strictly, and I believe that they should not change their standards and continue to apply the rules also on the Fein firm defense. And with this, I am thanks for your attention, and I will turn it over to John.
Thank you very much indeed, Massimo, and thanks to Amelia and for having me on this webinar. Now, I'm not going to talk about sectors, but I'm going to mention one or two particular cases as I go along. My organizing theme is going to be what I see as two risks to competition policy in crises, not just this crisis, but we saw it in 2008 and to some extent after the Brexit referendum in the UK as well. And those risks are, first, the risk that competition policy gets pushed back, gets forced to retreat because other policy imperatives override. But on the other hand, I think there are some risks of competition policy overdoing it, or expectations on competition policy makers being higher than they should be, which could lead to longer run costs. So I'm going to ask, should competition policy retreat, attack, or keep calm and carry on And I'm for the keep calm and carry on school, but with some very important caveats, including very much alertness about what is changing mid-crisis, what will be different afterwards, but of course we don't really know, and humility about all those uncertainties. I'm not going to talk about state aids. Massimo has said a good deal about that. I'm not going to talk about anti-competitive agreements either. But let me start with mergers. And on this, I very much want to agree and illustrate Massimo points about the importance of not relaxing policy. That is exactly what happened in a major instance in the UK following the crisis of 2008, when Lloyds wanted to acquire HBOS. HBOS Bank was in big trouble. The OFT thought there were competition problems. They were going to refer it for an in-depth investigation, but legislation was rushed through Parliament to create an exemption from normal competition scrutiny where there were financial stability issues, and we had that merger happen. Now, I'm not trying to say that financial stability is less important than competition, but here was a case where, with the, I think not only the benefit of hindsight, I think there were signs of this at the time, I think that was really quite a bad idea. The rest of the world, for financial stability reasons, thought it important to separate out good bank and bad bank. I'm putting it in simple terms. Here we had a merger in the hope that the Lloyds confidence magic would resolve the HBOS problems. In fact, it deepened the woes that Lloyds faced. So here was a relaxation of competition policy for the sake of financial stability, which was probably counterproductive for both. So I think that's very much a cautionary tale. Moreover, I don't think in that financial area, financial resilience, there are good reasons for saying we should ease off on competition policy for that sector for that other objective. Just as in environmental policy, I don't think there are good reasons to say, oh, it's fine for polluters to have cartels because that will reduce the amount of pollution. No, what you've got to do is pursue pollution policy properly and maintain rigorous competition policy. And the same is true when it comes to financial resilience. I don't believe there's a long-run trade-off that argues for backing off. Now, what about the failing firms point, which Massimo touched on? Here I think vigilance is the watchword. We have a classic case going on in the UK right now, which is the acquisition by Amazon of a stake in Deliveroo, where the Competition and Markets Authority has put out a provisional conclusions that for failing firm reasons, that deal be permitted. The case hasn't concluded, so we're still provisional stage. And what happens there, very much in line with what Massimo says, is a structured three-limb test where you ask, in this case, is Deliveroo going to exit the market because of the crisis without this deal happening? Secondly, is there a less anti-competitive investor than Amazon? And thirdly, what would happen in the event of exit? Now, all I know about this case is from the CMA website, where a lot of the most interesting things are scissored out and redacted. But that they are going through, and it's a perfect illustration of that structured kind of test. Now, I do think, though, that there are threats, including politically to merger policy, of pushback. But we had a week ago a setback to the European Commission's merger policy coming from, speaking for myself, an unexpected direction, which was a judgment from the court in Luxembourg in a UK mobile telephony case involving 3 and O2, which annulled a prohibition decision that the European Commission had made a few years ago. And here was a case, it was a 4-3 merger, so reasonable people can always disagree about those. But this was in the area of non-coordinated effects. So it wasn't that the merger was going to lead to collusion necessarily, it wasn't a dominance case, it was just a lessening of competition through non-coordinated effects. And I think it's fair to say it's the first big court judgment since the 2004 reforms of the European merger regulation, precisely to try and address those kinds of mergers. Now, we will see what the implications are of that judgment and any appeal into the future. But it's the courts are at work as well as other things in this time of crisis. Right, second point, completely different. I want to talk a little bit about the risk of competition policy overdoing it. And here I want to introduce a slightly different note from Massimo's. I think, in fact, the five of us are very like-minded, but I want to articulate on this excessive pricing point a somewhat different view. That there has been a lot of public policy concern, and I sympathize with it, about price rises, about profiteering, about unjustifiably high prices, and so on. But 2 points. First is the regular competition law approach to this, I think, is not a suitable instrument. We had a judgment in March from the UK Court of Appeal in a pharmaceutical case, Competition and Markets Authority against Flynn and Pfizer, which lays out the European and therefore current UK law on those issues. I don't see that as a useful tool. You have to prove dominance and so on. Whereas I think there are a number of market settings where we don't have dominant firms and yet where equilibrium prices are a lot higher. Should the Competition Authority be given powers to enter there? Well, I think there are certainly cases where there are big consumption externalities when we're talking about goods like protective equipment, face masks and the rest, where the price mechanism is clearly not going to be a great allocator of resources. But there are other sectors, and The Economist had an interesting article about puppies actually in a recent issue, where it does appear that you've had a big shift in supply and demand, so the equilibrium price is substantially higher. Now, is it the business of the Competition Authority, should it be, for them to go in, do something about that, lower prices, penalize people for charging high prices and the rest? Well, I would want to enter a cautionary note there. If you do try and, say, hold prices down below equilibrium levels, it's not even clear that that's good for consumers. If you look at, for example, Bulow-Klemperer JPE 2012, under pretty broad set of circumstances, because of the inefficiency of random rationing, unless you've got some very clever scheme, it's not clear that that is a sensible approach or even a pro-consumer approach, despite the political pressures that there might be to take action of that sort. You've also got to think about things like resale and all the rest of that. I'm on a panel for the Initiative on Global Markets, which has a weekly or fortnightly poll. There was a question which produced incredibly divided opinion on whether laws should be introduced to prevent high prices on essential goods. I was in the don't know category, and you had an amazing spread, unusually among academic economists there. I want to end on a slightly more provocative note still, drawing attention to a blog post of Paul Romer's, which was picked up by John Cochrane, and with a twist added to that, which was on, the Romer point was, how can it be that the US economy produces 350 million cans of soda a day, but doesn't seem to be very good at producing virus tests? And the Romer approach was less regulation, not more regulation. Decide what a test should do. As long as labs provide tests that do that, let them worry about the details, and don't appeal to charity. Be prepared to pay the labs twice as much for tests as we spend on soda. The Cochrane coda to that, which is controversial, but let me articulate it, is, moreover, allow people and businesses to pay the labs whatever the labs want to charge for the tests. And then on the Cochrane view, I'm not sure I sympathize with it, but I think it's worth articulating. You would do that, and you would require only that test results get reported to the regulatory authorities. So I mention that because of a wider point, that markets can produce problems, but they can also produce some solutions. And let us not forget altogether the risks of over-regulation, particularly when we want future resilience, which the market isn't always good at providing, but can do quite a bit towards. I will stop there, and Fiona, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, John. And thank you, Amelia, for the invitation to participate in the webinar. What I wanted to talk about today was merger review. The crisis has made me think more critically about merger review, and in particular, whether one of the elements in merger review that an agency considers should include increases in systemic risk. And that increase in systemic risk could be a merger-specific harm. This was brought to my attention actually by a law student of mine, Donnie Bloomfield, who wrote about it in a paper last year that's up on SSRN if you're interested. That's a law paper. John mentioned the banking systemic risk problem, which is a little bit different because there's an endogeneity to the crisis. Here with COVID-19, we have an exogenous shock. But nonetheless, that exogenous shock has big implications for consumers and consumer welfare. So let me give you a couple of examples from the US. We have allowed mergers in meat packing that have resulted in significant concentration. So now there are 5 or 6 big meat packing plants in the United States, and that's it. And they process thousands and thousands of animals, whether it's the ones doing cows or the ones doing pigs or chickens. And what's happened is the beef meatpacking plants have had a wave of coronavirus cases and have had to shut down in some cases, or controversially forced to stay open with sick workers. This then causes a shortage of beef, higher prices of beef, and that, of course, harms consumers in a way that I don't think anyone thought about when the mergers were being reviewed. Another example is generic drugs. This is an area where there's been quite a lot of merger activity over the last 10, 20 years. There are many fewer supply chains than there used to be. So now a particular molecule, instead of being made with 5 different unique supply chains, might have just 2. So that means that there's a supplier in China with a raw ingredient and a factory in New Jersey, and if there's a virus in that part of China and that raw material is not available, then instead of there being 4 other makers to pick up the slack, there's a severe shortage of that generic drug. This has important welfare consequences because generic drug makers are not going to be taking into account the full harm from not having morphine. We actually had a morphine shortage in the United States probably 7 or 8 years ago for other reasons. And it was terrible. People were in pain. Doctors had to use alternative, very expensive branded drugs because there wasn't generic morphine. If the generic drug industry is approximately zero profit, then the generic drug industry is not capturing the benefit of the reduction in pain with its prices at all, practically. So they're somewhat indifferent between producing and not producing because there's zero profit. And yet society is suffering a great deal from this lack of diversity in the supply chain and the susceptibility to systemic risk. So I think an agency could incorporate that in a merger review, and this would be particularly important in the categories I've just mentioned, like food, essential supplies, medical supplies, PPE, medicines, and the like. Another example from the US is we had an article in the Times a couple of months ago describing a killer acquisition in medical devices, ventilators. A large ventilator maker purchased an innovative startup of ventilators and shut down the project after it was purchased. And the allegation in the article was that these were competing providers of ventilators and that absent this merger, the small entrant would have grown and we would have had more competition and less concentration than we do now. Now, in principle, a killer acquisition can be dealt with in the normal way, the way we handle mergers without systemic risk. But I think actually it's worth considering systemic risk in this case in an interesting way. So one of the things that's very important for an agency to think about when there's the possibility of a shock like COVID is whether an industry has a diversity of strategies. So what do I mean by that? The acquiring firm had a strategy that was high cost, high quality, a huge ventilator, price of a car, all sorts of features and bells and whistles. The target had a strategy of low cost, low quality. not as many features, not as durable. I don't know what the other elements were. In the United States, our healthcare system is really geared to buy the high cost, high quality product because the people buying it typically are not spending their own money. The people using it are typically insured and not spending their own money. So everybody's incentive is to buy a higher cost item. But the founders of this simple ventilator had a vision for how to find demand somehow. They were going to think about public health applications. Maybe they were going to sell it abroad. I don't know, but they had a plan. And you might think about Clay Christensen's work, disruptive innovation, cheaper, simpler things coming from below and disrupting the more fancy product. But when that startup with that vision gets acquired by a firm whose strategy is high cost, high quality, there's no way the management is going to support that division doing something different. It's inconsistent with the assets of the acquiring firm. It's inconsistent with their brand. It's inconsistent with their market strategy with the marketing team. It's inconsistent with the CEO's beliefs about where demand lies and where technology is moving. So we can almost perfectly predict that this product is not going to be supported in its original form as a strategy. It's interesting to me that organizational economics of this form is not used very much in merger review, and I think this is a shame because it's quite helpful for understanding this diversity. So why am I focusing so much on diversity of strategy? Because when you get a big shock and there's suddenly a huge change in demand or supply or some other element of the environment because of something like COVID, it's very valuable to consumers to have different kinds of products out there that they can shift to when the nature of their demand changes. And if we allow mergers to consolidate and consolidate so that we only have two ways of doing things, that's going to be less robust as a system than if we had 8 ways of doing things. So I think this is an element that should be included in merger review and is particularly useful for products that are especially necessary, the food and the health and that nature of product. But I've not seen it being used, and I actually think that this crisis is really bringing to the fore some of the problems we've created with mergers that have reduced that robustness of our industries and we're now paying for. So that's all I wanted to say, and I'm going to pass the microphone and camera over to Jacques.
Well, thank you very much, Fiona and the others. It's a little bit nerve-wracking to speak about all of you. So I thought I would try to back up a little bit from the discussion and try to explain what I think are the difficulties of doing economics in a time of crisis as we have right now, and then try to use this more or less theoretical background to discuss briefly 3 of the issues which we've been speaking about: state aid, explicit coordination between firms, and mergers. So let me begin by why I think it's so difficult to do economics in the times of crisis. Now, general equilibrium theory is still the best basis that we have for our assumptions that the competition is a good thing. And if you think about general equilibrium theory, it assumes that the agents arrive in the market with a stock of resources. They've got labor, they've got the capital, they've got land, and so on. And then it goes on straight to predict what the results of trades between those agents will be. So it says, okay, here's what the equilibrium prices will be. On the other hand, it doesn't tell us at all how the trades will take place. And we know that it has often happened that economists have been over-optimistic when they have been thinking about the way markets will naturally organize themselves. For instance, in the advice which was given to Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, many people had the impression that you just liberalized and things would set in place easily. Now, what we do instead, I mean, I think the intuitive view that most of us have is that when an economy is functioning normally well, it's pretty close to what a competitive equilibrium would be, and that the prices adapt progressively to changes in technology, changes in taste, changes in the access to resources, and so on. The problem is that when the economy gets out of equilibrium, it takes time to go back, and it's not obvious how you do it. If we've got a moderate shock, basically we tell our economist friends, please take care of it. That's their job. On the other hand, when we think of a big crisis like the one we have now, where we are straying quite far away from equilibrium, we've got a big stock of unused resources, capital and labor, and we know very little, certainly in terms of economic theory, and I think also policy-wise, on the consequences of those big shocks. And I think therefore our thinking about what happens during and after the current crisis has to be provisional, and as John was stressing, we have to be very modest in what we can say. And this shows, for instance, I think very clearly in the way different countries have used different types of instruments to go through the crisis. Some countries have stressed insurance to individuals impacted by the crisis. So some people are having a hard time, we provide them with help. And that's been what has happened in the US, for instance, with increases in unemployment insurance and with checks sent to every single American taxpayer. On the other hand, some other countries, and France is one of them, have worked on trying to maintain the economic links within the system. And that's what the French chômage partiel system, where firms were paid in order to keep people, basically paid to keep people on the payroll, even if they were not working. And it seems that when you support that type of policy, which I think I do, it seems that the implicit model that we have of the economy is a model of a network economy, a bit at a la Matt Jackson. And clearly there are costs and benefits to both systems. The insurance lets market reallocate resources, and this can be very useful if the post-crisis world is very different from the pre-crisis world. You restart from zero. On the other hand, maintaining economic links will be better at avoiding costly tâtonnement once we get out of a crisis. So let me now turn and speak very briefly about some free competition policy issues in this slide. First, state aid. I mean, one thing which I think is important to stress is that in lots of ways, the state aid during the crisis is a substitute and complement for to support through budgetary rules, through moratorium on the taxes, moratorium on social contributions, and so on. We are basically trying to help the companies not go bankrupt and not having to go through expensive reorganization processes. And that's a way of maintaining economic links during the crisis. And most people agree that in this case, state aid rules should be relaxed. Massimo and John have spoken to that. I think there are two issues though, which maybe we could think about more deeply, is that first, if we think important to maintain the level playing field in Europe, how do we make sure that the rules for state aid are relaxed uniformly across the different countries in Europe? And secondly, given that state aid is part of a whole set of policies, should European authorities take into account the other forms of government support when judging specific state aid cases? Second point, the problem which also has been mentioned and of explicit coordination between firms discussing between themselves. Should we let them do that? Normally we are very, very strict, thanks to Adam Smith. And basically, I think the issue here is that normally we would think that firms coordinate through prices and through the market. There's a certain tâtonnement time, and they get to an equilibrium. We may not have time to do this during a crisis, and it's even more an issue if the authorities control the prices in some way or the other, and some form of rationing needs to be reinstated. And I really think that the line between rule of reason and per se illegality has to be shifted during the crisis. And finally, mergers, and again, this will be very close to what Massimo was saying, mergers which are due to the fact that the virus is changing the structure of the economy, for instance, lower demand for travel, then we don't need a relaxing of rules. We just need to take into account those new circumstances when we are doing the assessment of a merger. Then there are the mergers with a failing firm defense, which is linked directly to the crisis, and the Amazon Deliveroo case, which John mentioned, is part of this. Now, I think the issue there is that really this should be taken care through other instruments of public policy. It should be taken care through credit given to the firm which is in danger of failing. Now we've got a real problem there of coordination between different government policies, and there's a real issue for competition authorities. What do we do if this aid is not coming from another point? But I will have a tendency of saying then competition authorities should play tough and say too bad, somebody else takes care of the problem. And after this, I will give the floor back to Amelia.
Thank you very much. So if we actually all come on screen now. So we've had some questions already. If people want to send through more questions, please do say as soon as possible, because there's a time lag. In the meantime, before we turn to questions from others, I'm going to just ask some of you to respond to each other. In particular, Massimo, John already referred to Massimo, John referred to him having different views from you on pricing, excessive pricing. So I thought you might like to respond to that first of all.
Thank you, Amelia. Thank you very much. I believe that to have a good discussion is always a good thing. So I believe that to a large extent, John and I agree, but I will make a comment which points to a difference. So first of all, I perfectly agree that excessive price actions in antitrust are not the sort of the first best. It would be better to have, if you need it, consumer protection laws or the others. I also agree about the fact that when you have price regulation, you do not get rid of the problem. Indeed, what happens is that you might discourage supply responses, and that you would have anyway also rationing problems. However, perhaps this is a slightly technical point, but I disagree with John when you say that even in case of excessive prices, you should have first you should find the dominance, and even small firms can charge high price without being dominant. Actually, I do not agree with that, because what happens is that you might have situations in which although in ordinary times firms might not be dominant, they might have a very small market share, and in exceptional times they might have a dominant position, in the sense that they would have considerable market power. So if you have excess demand, for instance, we are in a very different situation in normal circumstances. So under normal demand conditions, then what happens is that if a firm sets a high price, then the rivals would use their spare capacity to undercut it and to sell more. But in a situation in which you have excess demand and that high price, each firm's demand is ways higher than its capacity, then no firms would have an incentive to cut prices, and hence even firms which normally have no market power would have it in exceptional times. And the same is true also in other cases which have led in other countries, perhaps not in Europe, to situations of excessive price or very, very high prices. Even, consider cases of markets for food and groceries. Then what happens there is that the firms which are normally constrained, retailers which are normally constrained, or supermarkets which are normally constrained because consumers shop around, what happens is that in a period of lockdown, when consumers do not shop around, they cannot even move. And even if they could move, they wouldn't want to move in order to avoid social contacts. Then even firms which in normal times would not be able to command high prices, then in exceptional times like these ones, they might have a lot of market power. So this is about excessive prices. I want just to make a comment on mergers again, and there I completely agree with what John said, in the sense that we are probably going to see competition authorities to be squeezed in, on the one hand, by lots of political pressure, because there are lots of governments in Europe which are basically making pressure on competition authorities and European Commission to relax merger control rules. This is something which was already in place before the crisis, and notably there was the Franco-German manifesto which was advocating for that. And my impression is that nowadays governments are sort of using the excuse of the COVID crisis in order to take away these more powers from the European Commission and the national competition authorities. So on the one hand, you have this political pressure, and then, as John was saying, unexpectedly, the General Court has handed down this judgment, which to my mind is very surprising. But I do not agree with the judgment. I believe that, their analysis is not well documented, and I believe that they set the standards to too much of a high level, because what happens is that in merger control, the analysis is prospective. So you cannot have a standard of proof which goes close to the reasonable, beyond reasonable doubt. But I must also say that I was chief economist at the time, so I believe in that case, and therefore I might not be the most objective when talking about this case.
Yeah, but I think you'd have full agreement from everybody on this panel with you with that last view. So John, I don't know whether you want to come back on that. And it struck me also that Jacques' point about tâtonnement, I don't know if I pronounced that right, tâtonnement, is a really good one on your point, your reference to Cochrane and the 350 million sodas that are made every year. That's because we have stable demand for sodas, and the infrastructure has set up over time. And yes, the commercial world is very good at dealing with that sort of thing. If we want a whole bunch of ventilators or a whole bunch of masks or whatever done very, very quickly, is it obvious that the market is as good at developing those, given both the empirics and the theory that that Jacques referred to?
Sure. Now, I mean, as I said earlier, I think our views are pretty close to each other, but that's boring for the viewers and runs contrary to Fiona's plea for diversity. So let me push it a little bit more. And I mean, on Fiona's point about having resilience as a criterion in merger review, I see that, but I fear it would be used more often by the defenders of deals that are against the public interest rather than by the protectors of the public interest. Depends how it's framed and cast. When you were speaking, it occurred to me, we do have plurality as a criterion in media. That's the only one I could quickly think of where something in your spirit comes into play. But
John, can you explain what you mean? Because the example I'm thinking of, this issue would essentially be a reason not to approve a merger.
no, you're having it as a one-way valve, I think, but I mean, the Lloyd's HBOS case I mentioned was a perfect example where effectively people said, resilience is what matters, so let's permit this merger.
Yeah.
So that's just an example of how, without safeguards, it can be used the other way around. But you know, I do take the point about things being needed urgently, and there's another quite good webinar series in which Larry Summers was speaking about 10 days ago, and he spoke about the shift in the economy from just in time to just in case. But the interesting question then is, who provides the just in case goods? Is that the state that has cleverly procured everything in advance, just like before the COVID pandemic? Not. Or is it other means? And I'm saying, even if it is state procurement, let's think about the market provision of these goods or these contingent goods. And let's not make commercially prospering in a crisis always a bad thing. Sometimes people who are providing much needed goods in a crisis, that's good, not bad. But a lot of the commentary and the mood music is as though it's something wicked about doing that. And I think we need to think more positively about how market forces can operate for good in a just-in-case economy as well as traditionally.
Jacques.
Can I intervene on this? John, but do you think it's politically realist, you know, to say that we're going to let people profit in times of crisis? I mean, assume that I had created a firm which was ready to produce masks and had spare capacity for 5 years. It had been very expensive. Now comes a crisis and I say, okay, I'm going to sell. That's my opportunity. I've got 2 months to recoup my investment and I'm going to sell my mask at a very high price. I think that at least in most continental European countries, there would have been price control and I wouldn't have been able to take advantage of this.
Well, I'm just pointing out a dilemma, a trade-off. If that is so repugnant that that even on average normal rate of return is just too repugnant, it's all got to be done on a kind of non-commercial basis, then one needs to set up some non-commercial means for doing it. I would not find it, one can vary the example, but I would not find it generically repugnant.
Me neither.
I'm providing just-in-case goods in a competitive way.
Possibly.
Fiona and Massimo, but both very, very quickly, because I want to get onto a question from the audience. Fiona.
We have a possible repugnant situation in the United States where we need testing. We don't have any. Nobody authorized the government to pay for it. And so now you're asking the private sector to invest in very specific testing equipment that's very expensive that we hope will be used for 1 year. How are you going to get people with a market system to do that? You'd have to pay an extraordinarily high price. I think that's a political problem.
Massimo. You're muted.
The problem that you, John, were touching upon is very similar to the one that you have in electricity markets, when basically what you have to do is to guarantee that the demand for electricity is covered even in extraordinary times, which might happen once a year or once every 2 years or something like that. So the answer there typically has been given through public procurement and with capacity mechanisms or capacity reserves, etc. So I think we can take inspiration from those markets in order to address those issues.
Okay, so thank you very much we've already had a very good discussion. We've not even got onto the questions. So I'm going to focus actually on 2 questions which are in the same space. Well, in fact, it's one question really, from 2 different people, Diane Coyle and John Stern, who are going to take us onto the world of digital. And in particular, with the focus on resilience that we've been having, how do we feel about resilience, thinking about big tech and how their position has grown during COVID-19? Does COVID-19 change anything, or does it just reaffirm what we thought anyway? Anyone want to take that?
I mean, I think it's perhaps, for me, increased my estimate of the social value of competition in those spaces. That these platforms in a time of crisis are extremely important. And therefore, I think competition in those spaces is even more important than I thought it was 6 months ago.
Would anyone else like to come in on that?
I wanted to make a nasty joke, but it was Commissioner Breton who had saved the world thanks to his interventions and prevented Netflix from ruining the internet, but I will pass on.
Well, I would just note that the shopping infrastructure has been much more resilient this year than would have been the case 20 years ago.
Well, that is a very good point. Yeah.
And we've actually seen in the US investment by Walmart and CVS and others in their online capabilities, a big push there and a big uptake by consumers. So that arguably has created more competition in e-commerce than we had before.
Very good. And then one final question to tuck in just before we go, which is from Magdalena Sath, who wondered, and this is going back right to the start, Massimo, to when we were talking about state aid and directing state aid at particular markets. And the question was, how do we get the objective market facts to know where we should be allocating that state aid if we're trying to divide between those where there's going to be temporary and those where there's going to be permanent impact? How do we figure that out?
There are certainly some difficulties, the difference between having guiding principles and then apply to particular sectors. But I think the principles are, in my view, those that I have mentioned. And then, of course, in particular sectors, you will have a part of the shocks will be permanent and part of the shock will be more temporary. But I think that by and large, the idea is that if a sector is going to be down the line to be downsized, and think, for instance, of some sectors which probably are going to have long run suffering from after the crisis, like I don't know, cinemas or I don't know, perhaps also airlines, etc. Then the point is that state aids should not be used in order to keep afloat firms which otherwise would have to downsize or to close down. So accompanying measures there should be welcome, but try to basically to preserve the status quo ante of before the crisis. I think it would be a bad idea.
Okay. We're probably out of time. There are actually some more very good questions, but I feel bad for not getting into them, but I think that we should probably stop there. Thank all of you very, very much. Highlight that there is also now an economics observatory funded by the ESRC looking at the economics of COVID-19, covering all sorts of things. There is a little bit on competition and consumer policy. It's mostly lots of other things, but it's a very interesting resource. Highlight that there is another of these webinars this time next week on apparently the EU response to COVID-19. So we can all tune in. And yeah, thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Amelia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.